Chapter 13. Troubled Dreams. Robert Audley left Southampton by the mail, and let himself into his chambers just as the dawn was creeping cold and grey into the solitary rooms, and the canaries were beginning to rustle their feathers feebly in the early morning. There were several letters in the box behind the door, but there was none from George Talboys. The young barrister was worn out by a long day spent in hurrying from place to place. The usual lazy monotony of his life had been broken, as it had never been broken before in 28 tranquil, easy-going years. His mind was beginning to grow confused upon the point of time. It seemed to him months since he had lost sight of George Talboys. It was so difficult to believe that it was less than 48 hours ago that the young man had left him asleep under the willows by the trout stream. His eyes were painfully weary for want of sleep. He searched about the room for some time, looking in all sorts of impossible places for a letter from George Talboys, and then threw himself dressed upon his friend's bed in the room with the canaries and geraniums. "I shall wait for tomorrow morning's post," he said, "and if that brings no letter from George, I shall start for Liverpool without a moment's delay." He was thoroughly exhausted, and fell into a heavy sleep, a sleep which was profound without being in any way refreshing, for he was tormented all the time by disagreeable dreams which were painful, not from any horror in themselves, but from a vague and wearying sense of their confusion and absurdity. At one time he was pursuing strange people and entering strange houses in the endeavor to unravel the mystery of the telegraphic dispatch. At another time he was in the churchyard at Ventnor, gazing at the headstone George had ordered for the grave of his dead wife. Once in the long rambling mystery of these dreams, he went to the grave, and found this headstone gone, and on remonstrating with the stonemason, was told that the man had a reason for removing the inscription, a reason that Robert would some day learn. In another dream, he saw the grave of Helen Talboys open, and while he waited, with the cold horror lifting up his hair to see the dead woman rise and stand before him, with her stiff charnel house drapery clinging about her rigid limbs, his uncle's wife tripped gaily out of the open grave, dressed in the crimson velvet robes in which the artist had painted her, and with her ringlets flashing like red gold in the unearthly light that shone about her. But into all these dreams the places he had last been in, and the people with whom he had last been concerned, were dimly interwoven, sometimes his uncle, sometimes Alicia, oftenest of all my lady, the trout stream in Essex, the lime walk at the court. Once he was walking in the black shadows of this long avenue, with Lady Audley hanging on his arm, when suddenly they heard a great knocking in the distance, and his uncle's wife wound her slender arms around him, crying out that it was the day of judgment, and that all wicked secrets must now be told. Looking at her as she shrieked this in his ear, he saw that her face had grown ghastly white, and that her beautiful golden ringlets were changing into serpents and slowly creeping down her fair neck. He started from his dream to find that there was someone really knocking at the outer door of his chambers. It was a dreary, wet morning, the rain beating against the windows, and the canaries twittering dismally to each other, complaining, perhaps, of the bad weather. Robert could not tell how long the person had been knocking. He had mixed the sound with his dreams, and when he woke he was only half conscious of other things. "It's that stupid Mrs. Maloney, I dare say," he muttered. "She may knock again for all I care. Why can't she use her duplicate key instead of dragging a man out of bed when he's half dead with fatigue?" The person, whoever it was, did knock again, and then desisted, apparently tired out. But about a minute afterward a key turned in the door. "She had her key with her all the time, then," said Robert. "I'm very glad I didn't get up." The door between the sitting-room and bedroom was half open, and he could see the laundress bustling about, dusting the furniture and rearranging things that had never been disarranged. "Is that you, Mrs. Maloney?" he asked. "Yes, sir." "Then why, in goodness' name, did you make that row at the door when you had a key with you all the time?" "A row at the door, sir?" "Yes, that infernal knocking." "Sure, I never knocked, Mr. Audley, but walked straight in with my key." "Then who did knock? There's been someone kicking up a row at that door for a quarter of an hour, I should think. You must have met him going downstairs." "But I'm rather late this morning, sir, for I've been in Mr. Martin's rooms first, and I've come straight from the floor above." Then you didn't see anyone at the door, or on the stairs?" "Not a mortal soul, sir." "Was ever anything so provoking?" said Robert. "To think that I should have let this person go away without ascertaining who he was or what he wanted. How do I know that it was not someone with a message or a letter from George Talboys?" "Sure, if it was, sir, he'll come again," said Mrs. Maloney, soothingly. "Yes, of course. If it was anything of consequence, he'll come again," muttered Robert. The fact was that from the moment of finding the telegraphic message at Southampton, all hope of hearing of George had faded out of his mind. He felt that there was some mystery involved in the disappearance of his friend, some treachery toward himself or toward George. What if the young man's greedy old father-in-law had tried to separate them on account of the monetary trust lodged in Robert Audley's hands? Or what if, since even in these civilized days all kinds of unsuspected horrors are constantly committed, what if the old man had decoyed George down to Southampton and made away with him in order to get possession of that £20,000 left in Robert's custody for little Georgie's use? But neither of these suppositions explained the telegraphic message, and it was the telegraphic message which had filled Robert's mind with a vague sense of alarm. The postman brought no letter from George Talboys, and the person who had knocked at the door of the chambers did not return between 7 and 9 o'clock. So Robert Audley left Figtree Court once more in search of his friend. This time he told the cabman to drive to the Euston station, and in 20 minutes he was on the platform, making inquiries about the trains. The Liverpool express had started half an hour before he reached the station, and he had to wait an hour and a quarter for a slow train to take him to his destination. Robert Audley chafed cruelly at this delay. Half a dozen vessels might sail for Australia while he roamed up and down the long platform, tumbling over trucks and porters and swearing at his ill luck. He bought the Times newspaper, and looked instinctively at the second column, with a morbid interest in the advertisements of people missing, sons, brothers, and husbands who had left their homes, never to return or to be heard of more. There was one advertisement of a young man found drowned somewhere on the Lambeth shore. What if that should have been George's fate? No, the telegraphic message involved his father-in-law and the fact of his disappearance, and every speculation about him must start from that point. It was 8 o'clock in the evening when Robert got into Liverpool, too late for anything except to make inquiries as to what vessel had sailed within the last 2 days for the Antipodes. An emigrant ship had sailed at 4 o'clock that afternoon, the Victoria Regia, bound for Melbourne. The result of his inquiries amounted to this: if he wanted to find out who had sailed in the Victoria Regia, he must wait until the next morning, and apply for information of that vessel. Robert Audley was at the office at 9 o'clock the next morning, and was the first person after the clerks who entered it. He met with every civility from the clerk to whom he applied. The young man referred to his books, and running his pen down the list of passengers who had sailed in the Victoria Regia, told Robert that there was no one among them of the name of Talboys. He pushed his inquiries further. Had any of the passengers entered their names within a short time of the vessel's sailing? One of the other clerks looked up from his desk as Robert asked this question. Yes, he said. He remembered a young man's coming into the office at 3:30 o'clock in the afternoon, and paying his passage money. His name was the last on the list, Thomas Brown. Robert Audley shrugged his shoulders. There could have been no possible reason for George's taking a feigned name. He asked the clerk who had last spoken if he could remember the appearance of this Mr. Thomas Brown. No, the office was crowded at that time. People were running in and out, and he had not taken any particular notice of this last passenger. Robert thanked them for their civility, and wished them good morning. As he was leaving the office, one of the young men called after him. "Oh, by the by, sir," he said, "I remember one thing about this Mr. Thomas Brown. His arm was in a sling." There was nothing more for Robert Audley to do but to return to town. He re-entered his chambers at 6 o'clock that evening, thoroughly worn out once more with his useless search. Mrs. Maloney brought him his dinner and a pint of wine from a tavern in the Strand. The evening was raw and chilly, and the laundress had lighted a good fire in the sitting-room grate. After eating about half a mutton chop, Robert sat with his wine untasted upon the table before him, smoking cigars and staring into the blaze. "George Talboys never sailed for Australia," he said, after long and painful reflection. "If he is alive, he is still in England, and if he is dead, His body is hidden in some corner of England." He sat for hours smoking and thinking, trouble and gloomy thoughts leaving a dark shadow upon his moody face, which neither the brilliant light of the gas nor the red blaze of the fire could dispel. Very late in the evening he rose from his chair, pushed away the table, wheeled his desk over to the fireplace, took out a sheet of foolscap, and dipped a pen in the ink. But after doing this he paused, leaned his forehead upon his hand, and once more relapsed into thought. "I shall draw up a record of all that has occurred between our going down to Essex and tonight, beginning at the very beginning." He drew up this record in short, detached sentences, which he numbered as he wrote. It ran thus: Journal of facts connected with the disappearance of George Talboys, inclusive of facts which have no apparent relation to that circumstance. In spite of the troubled state of his mind, he was rather inclined to be proud of the official appearance of this heading. He sat for some time looking at it with affection, and with the feather of his pen in his mouth. "Upon my word," he said, "I begin to think that I ought to have pursued my profession, instead of dawdling my life away as I have done." He smoked half a cigar before he had got his thoughts in proper train, and then began to write. 1. I write to Alicia, proposing to take George down to the court. 2. Alicia writes, objecting to the visit on the part of Lady Audley. 3. We go to Essex in spite of that objection. I see my lady. My lady refuses to be introduced to George on that particular evening on the score of fatigue. 4. Sir Michael invites George and me to dinner for the following evening. 5. My lady receives a telegraphic dispatch the next morning which summons her to London. 6. Alicia shows me a letter from my lady, in which she requests to be told when I and my friend Mr. Talboys mean to leave Essex. To this letter is subjoined a postscript, reiterating the above request. 7. We call at the court, and ask to see the house. My lady's apartments are locked. 8. We get at the aforesaid apartments by means of a secret passage, the existence of which is unknown to my lady. In one of the rooms we find her portrait. 9. George is frightened at the storm. His conduct is exceedingly strange for the rest of the evening. 10. George quite himself again the following morning. I propose leaving Audley Court immediately. He prefers remaining till the evening. 11. We go out fishing. George leaves me to go to the court. 12. The last positive information I can obtain of him in Essex is at the court, where the servant says he thinks Mr. Talboys told him he would go and look for my lady in the grounds. 13. I receive information about him at the station, which may or may not be correct. 14. I hear of him positively once more at Southampton, where, according to his father-in-law, he had been for an hour on the previous night. 15. The telegraphic message. When Robert Audley had completed this brief record, which he drew up with great deliberation, and with frequent pauses for reflection, alterations, and erasures, he sat for a long time contemplating the written page. At last he read it carefully over, stopping at some of the numbered paragraphs, and marking some of them with a pencil cross. Then he folded the sheet of foolscap, went over to a cabinet on the opposite side of the room, unlocked it, and placed the paper in that very pigeonhole into which he had thrust Alicia's letter, the pigeonhole marked important. Having done this, he returned to his easy-chair by the fire, pushed away his desk, and lighted a cigar. "It's as dark as midnight from first to last," he said, "and the clue to the mystery must be found either at Southampton or in Essex. Be it how it may, my mind is made up. I shall first go to Audley Court, and look for George Talboys in a narrow radius." Chapter 14. Phoebe's Suitor. Mr. George Talboys, any person who has met this gentleman since the 7th inst., or who possesses any information respecting him subsequent to that date, will be liberally rewarded on communicating with A.Z., 14 Chancery Lane. Sir Michael Audley read the above advertisement in the second column of the Times, as he sat at breakfast with my lady and Alicia 2 or 3 days after Robert's return to town. "Robert's friend has not yet been heard of, then?" said the baronet, after reading the advertisement to his wife and daughter. "As for that," replied my lady, I cannot help wondering that anyone can be silly enough to advertise for him. The young man was evidently of a restless, roving disposition, a sort of Bamfield Moore Carew of modern life, whom no attraction could ever keep in one spot. Though the advertisement appeared 3 successive times, the party at the Court attached very little importance to Mr. Talboys' disappearance, and after this one occasion his name was never again mentioned by either Sir Michael, my lady, or Alicia. Alicia Audley and her pretty stepmother were by no means any better friends after that quiet evening on which the young barrister had dined at the Court. "She is a vain, frivolous, heartless little coquette," said Alicia, addressing herself to her Newfoundland dog Caesar, who was the sole recipient of the young lady's confidences. "She is a practised and consummate flirt, Caesar, and not contented with setting her yellow ringlets and her silly giggle at half the men in Essex, she must needs make that stupid cousin of mine dance attendance upon her. I haven't common patience with her." In proof of which last assertion, Miss Alice Audley treated her stepmother with such very palpable impertinence that Sir Michael felt himself called upon to remonstrate with his only daughter. "The poor little woman is very sensitive, you know, Alicia," the baronet said gravely, "and she feels your conduct most acutely." "I don't believe it a bit, papa," answered Alicia stoutly. "You think her sensitive because she has soft little white hands, and big blue eyes with long lashes, and all manner of affected fantastical ways which you stupid men call fascinating. Sensitive! Why, I've seen her do cruel things with those slender white fingers, and laugh at the pain she inflicted. I'm very sorry, papa," she added, softened a little by her father's look of distress, "though she has come between us, and robbed poor Alicia of the love of that dear generous heart. I wish I could like her for your sake. But I can't, and no more can Caesar. She came up to him once with her red lips apart, and her little white teeth glistening between them, and stroked his great head with her soft hand. But if I had not had hold of his collar, he would have flown at her throat and strangled her. She may bewitch every man in Essex, but she'd never make friends with my dog." "Your dog shall be shot," answered Sir Michael angrily, "if his vicious temper ever endangers Lucy." The Newfoundland rolled his eyes slowly round in the direction of the speaker, as if he understood every word that had been said. Lady Audley happened to enter the room at this very moment, and the animal cowered down by the side of his mistress with a suppressed growl. There was something in the manner of the dog which was, if anything, more indicative of terror than of fury. Incredible as it appears that Caesar should be frightened by so fragile a creature as Lucy Audley. Amicable as was my lady's nature, she could not live long at the Court without discovering Alicia's dislike to her. She never alluded to it but once. Then, shrugging her graceful white shoulders, she said with a sigh, "It seems very hard that you cannot love me, Alicia, for I have never been used to make enemies. But since it seems that it must be so, I cannot help it. If we cannot be friends, let us be neutral. You won't try to injure me?" "Injure you?" exclaimed Alicia. "How should I injure you?" "You'll not try to deprive me of your father's affection?" "I may not be as amiable as you are, my lady, and I may not have the same sweet smiles and pretty words for every stranger I meet, but I am not capable of a contemptible meanness, and even if I were, I think you are so secure of my father's love that nothing but your own act will ever deprive you of it." "What a severe creature you are, Alicia," said my lady, making a little grimace. "I suppose you mean to infer by all that I'm deceitful. Why, I can't help smiling at people, and speaking prettily to them. I know I'm no better than the rest of the world, but I can't help it if I'm pleasanter. It's constitutional." Alicia, having thus entirely shut the door upon all intimacy between Lady Audley and herself, and Sir Michael being chiefly occupied in agricultural pursuits and manly sports which kept him away from home, it was perhaps natural that my lady, being of an eminently social disposition, should find herself thrown a good deal upon her white eyelashed maid for society. Phoebe Marks was exactly the sort of a girl who was generally promoted from the post of lady's maid to that of companion. She had just sufficient education to enable her to understand her mistress when Lucy chose to allow herself to run riot in a species of intellectual tarantella, in which her tongue went mad to the sound of its own rattle, as the Spanish dancer at the noise of his castanets. Phoebe knew enough of the French language to be able to dip into the yellow paper-covered novels which my lady ordered from the Burlington Arcade, and to discourse with her mistress upon the questionable subjects of these romances. The likeness which the lady's maid bore to Lucy Audley was, perhaps, a point of sympathy between the two women. It was not to be called a striking likeness. A stranger might have seen them both together and yet have failed to remark it. But there were certain dim and shadowy lights, in which, meeting Phoebe Marks gliding softly through the dark oak passages of the court, or under the shrouded avenues in the garden, you might have easily mistaken her for my lady. Sharp October winds were sweeping the leaves from the limes in the long avenue, and driving them in withered heaps with a ghostly rustling noise along the dry gravel walks. The old well must have been half choked up with the leaves that drifted about it, and whirled in eddying circles into its black, broken mouth. On the still bosom of the fish-pond, the same withered leaves slowly rotted away, mixing themselves with the tangled weeds that discolored the surface of the water. All the gardeners Sir Michael could employ could not keep the impress of autumn's destroying hand from the grounds about the court. "How I hate this desolate month," my lady said, as she walked about the garden shivering beneath her sable mantle. "Everything dropping to ruin and decay, and the cold flicker of the sun lighting up the ugliness of the earth, as the glare of gas lamps lights the wrinkles of an old woman. Shall I ever grow old, Phoebe? Will my hair ever drop off as the leaves are falling from those trees, and leave me wan and bare like them? What is to become of me when I grow old?" She shivered at the thought of this more than she had done at the cold wintry breeze, and muffling herself closely in her fur, walked so fast that her maid had some difficulty in keeping up with her. "Do you remember, Phoebe?" she said presently, relaxing her pace. "Do you remember that French story we read? The story of a beautiful woman who had committed some crime, I forget what, in the zenith of her power and loveliness, when all Paris drank to her every night, and when the people ran away from the carriage of the king to flock about hers and get a peep at her face? Do you remember how she kept the secret of what she had done, for nearly half a century, spending her old age in her family chateau, beloved and honored by all the province as an uncanonized saint and benefactress to the poor, and how, when her hair was white and her eyes almost blind with age, the secret was revealed through one of those strange accidents by which such secrets always are revealed in romances, and she was tried, found guilty, and condemned to be burned alive? The king who had worn her colors was dead and gone. The court of which she had been a star had passed away. Powerful functionaries and great magistrates, who might perhaps have helped her, were mouldering in the graves. Brave young cavaliers who would have died for her had fallen upon distant battlefields. She had lived to see the age to which she had belonged fade like a dream. And she went to the stake, followed by only a few ignorant country people, who forgot all her bounties and hooted at her for a wicked sorceress. "I don't care for such dismal stories, my lady," said Phoebe Marks with a shudder. "One has no need to read books to give one the horrors in this dull place." Lady Audley shrugged her shoulders and laughed at her maid's candor. "It is a dull place, Phoebe," she said, "though it doesn't do to say so to my dear old husband. Though I am the wife of one of the most influential men in the county, I don't know that I wasn't nearly as well off at Mr. Dawson's, and yet it's something to wear sables that cost 60 guineas, and have £1,000 spent on the decoration of one's apartments." Treated as a companion by her mistress, in the receipt of the most liberal wages, and with perquisites such as perhaps lady's maid had never had before, it was strange that Phoebe Marks should wish to leave her situation, but it was not the less a fact that she was anxious to exchange all the advantages of Audley Court for the very unpromising prospect which awaited her as the wife of her cousin Luke. The young man had contrived in some manner to associate himself with the improved fortunes of his sweetheart. He had never allowed Phoebe any peace, till she had obtained for him, by the aid of my lady's interference, a situation as undergroom of the court. He never rode out with either Alicia or Sir Michael, but on one of the few occasions upon which my lady mounted the pretty little grey thoroughbred reserved for her use, he contrived to attend her in her ride. He saw enough, in the very first half-hour they were out, to discover that, graceful as Lucy Audley might look in her long blue cloth habit, she was a timid horsewoman, and utterly unable to manage the animal she rode. Lady Audley remonstrated with her maid upon her folly in wishing to marry the uncouth groom. The two women were seated together over the fire in my lady's dressing-room, the grey sky closing in upon the October afternoon, and the black tracery of ivy darkening the casement windows. "You surely are not in love with the awkward, ugly creature, are you, Phoebe?" asked my lady sharply. The girl was sitting on a low stool at her mistress's feet. She did not answer my lady's question immediately, but sat for some time looking vacantly into the red abyss in the hollow fire. Presently she said, rather as if she had been thinking aloud than answering Lucy's question, "I don't think I can love him. We have been together from children, and I promised, when I was little better than 15, that I'd be his wife. I daren't break that promise now. There have been times when I've made up the very sentence I meant to say to him, telling him that I couldn't keep my faith with him, but the words have died upon my lips, and I've sat looking at him with a choking sensation in my throat that wouldn't let me speak. I daren't refuse to marry him. I've often watched and watched him, as he has sat slicing away at a hedge-stake with his great clasp knife, till I have thought that it is just such men as he who have decoyed their sweethearts into lonely places, and murdered them for being false to their word. When he was a boy he was always violent and revengeful. I saw him once take up that very knife in a quarrel with his mother. I tell you, my lady, I must marry him." "You silly girl, you shall do nothing of the kind," answered Lucy. "You think he'll murder you, do you? Do you think, then, if murder is in him, you would be any safer as his wife? If you thwarted him or made him jealous, if he wanted to marry another woman or to get hold of some poor, pitiful bit of money of yours, couldn't he murder you then? I tell you, you shan't marry him, Phoebe. In the first place, I hate the man, and in the next place, I can't afford to part with you. We'll give him a few pounds and send him about his business." Phoebe Marks caught my lady's hand in hers, and clasped them convulsively. "My lady, my good, kind mistress," she cried vehemently, "don't try to thwart me in this. Don't ask me to thwart him. I tell you, I must marry him. You don't know what he is. It will be my ruin and the ruin of others if I break my word. I must marry him." "Very well, then, Phoebe," answered her mistress. "I can't oppose you. There must be some secret at the bottom of all this." "There is, my lady," said the girl, with her face turned away from Lucy. "I shall be very sorry to lose you, but I have promised to stand your friend in all things. What does your cousin mean to do for a living when you are married?" "He would like to take a public house." "Then he shall take a public house, and the sooner he drinks himself to death the better. Sir Michael dines at a bachelor's party at Major Margrave's this evening, and my stepdaughter is away with her friends at the Grange. You can bring your cousin into the drawing-room after dinner, and I'll tell him what I mean to do for him." "You are very good, my lady," Phoebe answered with a sigh. Lady Audley sat in the glow of firelight and wax candles in the luxurious drawing-room, the amber damask cushions of the sofa contrasting with her dark violet velvet dress, and her rippling hair falling about her neck in a golden haze. Everywhere around her were the evidences of wealth and splendor, while in strange contrast to all this, and to her own beauty, the awkward groom stood rubbing his bullet head as my lady explained to him what she intended to do for her confidential maid. Lucy's promises were very liberal, and she had expected that, uncouth as the man was, he would, in his own rough manner, have expressed his gratitude. To her surprise, he stood staring at the floor without uttering a word in answer to her offer. Phoebe was standing close to his elbow, and seemed distressed at the man's rudeness. "Tell my lady how thankful you are, Luke," she said.
"But I'm not so over and above thankful," answered her lover, savagely. £50 ain't much to start a public. You'll make it 100, my lady."
"I shall do nothing of the kind," said Lady Audley, her clear blue eyes flashing with indignation, "and I wonder at your impertinence in asking it."
"Oh, yes, you will, though," answered Luke, with quiet insolence that had a hidden meaning. "You'll make it 100, my lady."
Lady Audley rose from her seat, looked the man steadfastly in the face till his determined gaze sunk under hers, then walking straight up to her maid, she said in a high, piercing voice, peculiar to her in moments of intense agitation, "Phoebe Marks, you have told this man." The girl fell on her knees at my lady's feet. "Oh, forgive me, forgive me," she cried. "He forced it from me, or I would never, never have told." Chapter 15. On the Watch. Upon a lowering morning late in November, with the yellow fog low upon the flat meadows, and the blinded cattle groping their way through the dim obscurity, and blundering stupidly against black and leafless hedges, or stumbling into ditches, undistinguishable in the hazy atmosphere, with the village church looming brown and dingy through the uncertain light, with every winding path and cottage door, every gable end and gray old chimney, every village child and straggling cur seeming strange and weird of aspect in the semi-darkness, Phoebe Marks and her cousin Luke made their way through the churchyard of Audley, and presented themselves before a shivering curate, whose surplice hung in damp folds, soddened by the morning mist, and whose temper was not improved by his having waited 5 minutes for the bride and bridegroom. Luke Marks, dressed in his ill-fitting Sunday clothes, looked by no means handsomer than in his everyday apparel, but Phoebe, arrayed in a rustling silk of delicate gray, that had been worn about 6 times by her mistress, looked, as the few spectators of the ceremony remarked, quite the lady. A very dim and shadowy lady, vague of outline and faint of coloring, with eyes, hair, complexion, and dress, all melting into such pale and uncertain shades, that, in the obscure light of the foggy November morning, a superstitious stranger might have mistaken the bride for the ghost of some other bride, dead and buried in the vault below the church. Mr. Luke Marks, the hero of the occasion, thought very little of all this. He had secured the wife of his choice, and the object of his lifelong ambition, a public house. My lady had provided the £75 necessary for the purchase of the goodwill and fixtures, with the stock of ales and spirits, of a small inn in the centre of a lonely little village, perched on the summit of a hill, called Mount Stanning. It was not a very pretty house to look at. It had something of a tumble-down, weather-beaten appearance, standing as it did upon high ground, sheltered only by 4 or 5 bare and overgrown poplars that had shot up too rapidly for their strength, and had a blighted, forlorn look in consequence. The wind had had its own way with the Castle Inn, and had sometimes made cruel use of its power. It was the wind that battered and bent the low, thatched roofs of outhouses and stables, till they hung over and lurched forward, as a slouched hat hangs over the low forehead of some village ruffian. It was the wind that shook and rattled the wooden shutters before the narrow casements till they hung broken and dilapidated upon their rusty hinges. It was the wind that overthrew the pigeon-house, and broke the vane that had been imprudently set up to tell the movements of its mightiness. It was the wind that made light of any little bit of wooden trellis-work, or creeping plant, or tiny balcony, or any modest decoration whatsoever, and tore and scattered it in its scornful fury. It was the wind that left mossy secretions on the discolored surface of the plaster walls. It was the wind, in short, that shattered and ruined and rent, and trampled upon the tottering pile of buildings, and then flew shrieking off, to riot and glory in its destroying strength. The dispirited proprietor grew tired of his long struggle with this mighty enemy, so the wind was left to work its own will, and the Castle Inn fell slowly to decay. But for all that it suffered without, it was not the less prosperous within doors. Sturdy drovers stopped to drink at the little bar. Well-to-do farmers spent their evenings and talked politics in the low wainscoted parlor, while their horses munched some suspicious mixture of mouldy hay and tolerable beans in the tumble-down stables. Sometimes even the members of the Audley Hunt stopped to drink and bait their horses at the Castle Inn, while, on one grand and never-to-be-forgotten occasion, a dinner had been ordered by the master of the hounds for some 30 gentlemen, and the proprietor driven nearly mad by the importance of the demand. So Luke Marks, who was by no means troubled with an eye for the beautiful, thought himself very fortunate in becoming the landlord of the Castle Inn, Mount Stanning. A chaise cart was waiting in the fog to convey the bride and bridegroom to their new home, and a few of the villagers, who had known Phoebe from a child, were lingering around the churchyard gate to bid her good-bye. Her pale eyes were still paler from the tears she had shed, and the red rims which surrounded them. The bridegroom was annoyed at this exhibition of emotion. "What are you blubbering for, lass?" he said, fiercely. "If you didn't want to marry me, you should have told me so. I ain't going to murder you, am I?" The lady's maid shivered as he spoke to her, and dragged her little silk mantle closely around her. "You're cold in all this here finery," said Luke, staring at her costly dress with no expression of goodwill. "Why can't women dress according to their station? You won't have no silk gowns out of my pocket, I can tell you." He lifted the shivering girl into the chaise, wrapped a rough greatcoat about her, and drove off through the yellow fog, followed by a feeble cheer from 2 or 3 urchins clustered around the gate. A new maid was brought from London to replace Phoebe Marks about the person of my lady, a very showy damsel, who wore a black satin gown and rose-colored ribbons in her cap, and complained bitterly of the dullness of Audley Court. But Christmas brought visitors to the rambling old mansion. A country squire and his fat wife occupied the tapestried chamber. Merry girls scampered up and down the long passages, and young men stared out of the latticed windows, watching for southerly winds and cloudy skies. There was not an empty stall in the roomy old stables. An extempore forge had been set up in the yard for the shoeing of hunters. Yelping dogs made the place noisy with their perpetual clamor. Strange servants herded together on the garret story, and every little casement hidden away under some pointed gable, and every dormer window in the quaint old roof, glimmered upon the winter's night with its separate taper, till, coming suddenly upon Audley Court, the benighted stranger, misled by the light and noise and bustle of the place, might have easily fallen into young Marlowe's error, and have mistaken the hospitable mansion for a good old-fashioned inn, such as have faded from this earth since the last mail-coach, and prancing tits took their last melancholy journey to the knacker's yard. Among other visitors, Mr. Robert Audley came down to Essex for the hunting season, with 6 French novels, a case of cigars, and 3 pounds of Turkish tobacco in his portmanteau. The honest young country squires, who talked all breakfast-time of flying Dutchman fillies and Voltigeur colts, of glorious runs of 7 hours' hard riding over 3 counties, and a midnight homeward ride of 30 miles upon their covert hacks, and who ran away from the well-spread table with their mouths full of cold sirloin, to look at that off pastern or that sprained forearm, or the colt that had just come back from the veterinary surgeon's, set down Robert Audley, dawdling over a slice of bread and marmalade, as a person utterly unworthy of any remark whatsoever. The young barrister had brought a couple of dogs with him, and the country gentleman who gave £50 for a pointer, and travelled a couple of 100 miles to look at a leash of setters before he struck a bargain, laughed aloud at the 2 miserable curs, one of which had followed Robert Audley through Chancery Lane and half the length of Holborn, while his companion had been taken by the barrister vie et armée from a costermonger who was ill-using him. And as Robert furthermore insisted on having these 2 deplorable animals under his easy-chair in the drawing-room, much to the annoyance of my lady, who, as we know, hated all dogs, the visitors at Audley Court looked upon the baronet's nephew as an inoffensive species of maniac. During other visits to the court, Robert Audley had made a feeble show of joining in the sports of the merry assembly. He had jogged across 6 ploughed fields on a quiet gray pony of Sir Michael's, and drawing up breathless and panting at door of some farmhouse, had expressed his intention of following the hounds no further that morning. He had even gone so far as to put on, with great labor, a pair of skates, with a view to taking a turn on the frozen surface of the fish-pond, and had fallen ignominiously at the first attempt, lying placidly extended on the flat of his back, until such time as the bystanders should think fit to pick him up. He had occupied the back seat in a dog-cart during a pleasant morning drive, vehemently protesting against being taken uphill, and requiring the vehicle to be stopped every 10 minutes in order to readjust the cushions. But this year he showed no inclination for any of these outdoor amusements, and he spent his time entirely in lounging in the drawing-room, and making himself agreeable, after his own lazy fashion, to my lady and Alicia. Lady Audley received her nephew's attentions in that graceful, half-childish fashion which her admirers found so charming, but Alicia was indignant at the change in her cousin's conduct. "You were always a poor, spiritless fellow, Bob," said the young lady contemptuously, as she bounced into the drawing-room in her riding habit after a hunting breakfast, from which Robert had absented himself, preferring a cup of tea in my lady's boudoir. "But this year I don't know what has come to you. You are good for nothing but to hold a skein of silk, or read Tennyson to Lady Audley."
"My dear, hasty, impetuous Alicia, don't be violent," said the young man imploringly. "A conclusion isn't a 5-barred gate, and you needn't give your judgment its head, as you give your mare Atalanta hers, when you're flying across country at the heels of an unfortunate fox. Lady Audley interests me, and my uncle's county friends do not. Is that a sufficient answer, Alicia?"
Miss Audley gave her head a little scornful toss. "It's as good an answer as I shall ever get from you, Bob," she said impatiently. "But pray amuse yourself in your own way, loll in an easy-chair all day with those 2 absurd dogs asleep on your knees, spoil my lady's window-curtains with your cigars, and annoy everybody in the house with your stupid, inanimate countenance." Mr. Robert Audley opened his handsome gray eyes to their widest extent at this tirade, and looked helplessly at Miss Alicia. The young lady was walking up and down the room, slashing the skirt of her habit with her riding-whip. Her eyes sparkled with an angry flash, and a crimson glow burned under her clear brown skin. The young barrister knew very well, by these diagnostics, that his cousin was in a passion. "Yes," she repeated, "your stupid, inanimate countenance. Do you know, Robert Audley, that with all your mock amiability, you are brimful of conceit and superciliousness? You look down upon our amusements. You lift up your eyebrows, and shrug your shoulders, and throw yourself back in your chair, and wash your hands of us and our pleasures. You are a selfish, cold-hearted sybarite."
"Alicia! Good gracious me!"
The morning paper dropped out of his hands, and he sat feebly staring at his assailant. "Yes, selfish, Robert Audley. You take home half-starved dogs, because you like half-starved dogs. You stoop down and pat the head of every good-for-nothing cur in the village street, because you like good-for-nothing curs. You notice little children, and give them halfpence, because it amuses you to do so. But you lift your eyebrows a quarter of a yard when poor Sir Harry Towers tells a stupid story, and stare the poor fellow out of countenance with your lazy insolence. As to your amiability, you would let a man hit you and say 'thank you' for the blow, rather than take the trouble to hit him again, but you wouldn't go half a mile out of your way to serve your dearest friend. Sir Harry is worth 20 of you, though he did write to ask me if my Mair Atalanta had recovered from the sprain. He can't spell or lift his eyebrows to the roots of his hair, but he would go through fire and water for the girl he loves, while you—" At this very point, when Robert was most prepared to encounter his cousin's violence, and when Miss Alicia seemed about to make her strongest attack, the young lady broke down altogether, and burst into tears. Robert sprang from his easy-chair, upsetting his dogs on the carpet.
"Alicia, my darling, what is it?"
It's the feather of my hat that got into my eyes,"
sobbed his cousin, and before he could investigate the truth of this assertion, Alicia had darted out of the room. Robert Audley was preparing to follow her, when he heard her voice in the courtyard below, amidst the tramping of horses and the clamor of visitors, dogs, and grooms. Sir Harry Towers, the most aristocratic young sportsman in the neighborhood, had just taken her little foot in his hand as she sprung into her saddle.
"Good heaven!" exclaimed Robert,
as he watched the merry party of equestrians until they disappeared under the archway.
"What does all this mean? How charmingly she sits her horse! What a pretty figure, too, and a fine, candid, brown, rosy face. But to fly at a fellow like that without the least provocation! That's the consequence of letting a girl follow the hounds. She learns to look at everything in life as she does at 6 feet of timber or a sunk fence. She goes through the world as she goes across country, straight ahead and over everything. Such a nice girl as she might have been, too, if she'd been brought up in Fig-tree Court. If ever I marry and have daughters, which remote contingency may heaven forfend, They shall be educated in paper buildings, take their sole exercise in the Temple Gardens, and they shall never go beyond the gates till they are marriageable, when I will walk them straight across Fleet Street to St. Dunstan's Church, and deliver them into the hands of their husbands."
With such reflections as these did Mr. Robert Audley beguile the time until my lady re-entered the drawing-room, fresh and radiant in her elegant morning costume, her yellow curls glistening with the perfumed waters in which she had bathed, and her velvet-covered sketch-book in her arms. She planted a little easel upon a table by the window, seated herself before it, and began to mix the colors upon her palette, Robert watching her out of his half-closed eyes.
"You are sure my cigar does not annoy you, Lady Audley?"
"Oh, no, indeed. I am quite used to the smell of tobacco. Mr. Dawson, the surgeon, smoked all the evening when I lived in his house."
"Dawson is a good fellow, isn't he?"
Robert asked carelessly. My lady burst into her pretty, gushing laugh. "The dearest of good creatures," she said. "He paid me £25 a year. Only fancy, £25. That made £6 a quarter. How well I remember receiving the money. 6 dingy old sovereigns and a little heap of untidy, dirty silver that came straight from the till in the surgery. And then how glad I was to get it. While now, I can't help laughing while I think of it. These colors I am using cost a guinea each at Windsor and Newton's, the carmine and ultramarine 30 shillings. I gave Mrs. Dawson one of my silk dresses the other day, and the poor thing kissed me, and the surgeon carried the bundle home under his cloak." My lady laughed long and joyously at the thought. Her colors were mixed; she was copying a water-colored sketch of an impossibly Turneresque atmosphere. The sketch was nearly finished, and she had only to put in some critical little touches with the most delicate of her sable pencils. She prepared herself daintily for the work, looking sideways at the painting. All this time Mr. Robert Audley's eyes were fixed intently on her pretty face.
"It is a change," he said, after so long a pause that my lady might have forgotten what she had been talking of. "It is a change. Some women would do a great deal to accomplish such a change as that."
Lady Audley's clear blue eyes dilated as she fixed them suddenly on the young barrister. The wintry sunlight, gleaming full upon her face from a side window, lit up the azure of those beautiful eyes, till their color seemed to flicker and tremble betwixt blue and green, as the opal tints of the sea change upon a summer's day. The small brush fell from her hand, and blotted out the peasant's face under a widening circle of crimson lake. Robert Audley was tenderly coaxing the crumbled leaf of his cigar with cautious fingers.
"My friend at the corner of Chancery Lane has not given me such good Manillas as usual," he murmured. "If ever you smoke, my dear aunt, and I am told that many women take a quiet weed under the rose, be very careful how you choose your cigars."
My lady drew a long breath, picked up her brush, and laughed aloud at Robert's advice. "What an eccentric creature you are, Mr. Audley. Do you know that you sometimes puzzle me?"
"Not more than you puzzle me, dear aunt."
My lady put away her colors and sketch-book, and seating herself at the deep recess of another window, at a considerable distance from Robert Audley, settled to a large piece of Berlin wool-work, a piece of embroidery which the Penelopes of 10 or 12 years ago were very fond of exercising their ingenuity upon, the olden time at Bolton Abbey. Seated in the embrasure of this window, my lady was separated from Robert Audley by the whole length of the room, and the young man could only catch an occasional glimpse of her fair face, surrounded by its bright aureole of hazy, golden hair. Robert Audley had been a week at the court, but as yet neither he nor my lady had mentioned the name of George Talboys. This morning, however, after exhausting the usual topics of conversation, Lady Audley made an inquiry about her nephew's friend. "That Mr. George, she said, hesitating.
"Talboys," suggested Robert.
"Yes, to be sure, Mr. George Talboys. Rather a singular name, by the by, and certainly, by all accounts, a very singular person. Have you seen him lately?"
"I have not seen him since the 7th of September last, the day upon which he left me asleep in the meadows on the other side of the village."
"Dear me," exclaimed my lady. What a very strange young man this Mr. George Talboys must be. Pray tell me all about it."
Robert told, in a few words, of his visit to Southampton and his journey to Liverpool, with their different results, my lady listening very attentively. In order to tell this story to better advantage, the young man left his chair, and crossing the room, took up his place opposite to Lady Audley, in the embrasure of the window.
"And what do you infer from all this?" asked my lady, after a pause.
"It is so great a mystery to me," he answered, "that I scarcely dare to draw any conclusion whatever. But in the obscurity I think I can grope my way to two suppositions, which to me seem almost certainties."
"And they are?"
"First, that George Talboys never went beyond Southampton. Second, that he never went to Southampton at all."
"But you traced him there. His father-in-law had seen him."
"I have reason to doubt his father-in-law's integrity."
"Good gracious me!" cried my lady, piteously. "What do you mean by all this?"
"Lady Audley," answered the young man, gravely, "I have never practiced as a barrister. I have enrolled myself in the ranks of a profession, the members of which hold solemn responsibilities and have sacred duties to perform, and I have shrunk from those responsibilities and duties, as I have from all the fatigues of this troublesome life. But we are sometimes forced into the very position we have most avoided, and I have found myself lately compelled to think of these things. Lady Audley, did you ever study the theory of circumstantial evidence?"
"How can you ask a poor little woman about such horrid things?" exclaimed my lady.
"Circumstantial evidence," continued the young man, as if he had scarcely heard Lady Audley's interruption, "that wonderful fabric which is built out of straws collected at every point of the compass, and which is yet strong enough to hang a man. Upon what infinitesimal trifles may sometimes hang the whole secret of some wicked mystery, inexplicable heretofore to the wisest upon the earth. A scrap of paper, a shred of some torn garment, the button off a coat, a word dropped incautiously from the overcautious lips of guilt, the fragment of a letter, the shutting or opening of a door, a shadow on a window blind, the accuracy of a moment tested by one of Benson's watches, 1,000 circumstances so slight as to be forgotten by the criminal, but links of iron in the wonderful chain forged by the science of the detective officer, and lo, the gallows is built up, the solemn bell tolls through the dismal grey of the early morning, the drop creaks under the guilty feet, and the penalty of crime is paid."
Faint shadows of green and crimson fell upon my lady's face from the painted escutcheons in the mullioned window by which she sat, but every trace of the natural color of that face had faded out, leaving it a ghastly ashen grey. Sitting quietly in her chair, her head fallen back upon the amber damask cushions, and her little hands lying powerless in her lap, Lady Audley had fainted away.
"The radius grows narrower day by day," said Robert Audley. "George Talboys never reached Southampton."
Chapter 16. Robert Audley gets his congé. The Christmas week was over, and one by one the country visitors dropped away from Audley Court. The fat squire and his wife abandoned the grey tapestried chamber, and left the black-browed warriors looming from the wall to scowl upon and threaten new guests, or to glare vengefully upon vacancy. The merry girls on the second story packed, or caused to be packed, their trunks and imperials, and tumbled gauze ball dresses were taken home that had been brought fresh to Audley. Blundering old family chariots, with horses whose untrimmed fetlocks told of rougher work than even country roads, were brought round to the broad space before the grim oak door, and laden with chaotic heaps of womanly luggage. Pretty rosy faces peeped out of carriage windows to smile the last farewell upon the group at the hall door, as the vehicle rattled and rumbled under the ivied archway. Sir Michael was in request everywhere, shaking hands with the young sportsmen, kissing the rosy-cheeked girls, sometimes even embracing portly matrons who came to thank him for their pleasant visit. Everywhere genial, hospitable, generous, happy, and beloved, the baronet hurried from room to room, from the hall to the stables, from the stables to the courtyard, from the courtyard to the arched gateway to speed the parting guest. My lady's yellow curls flashed hither and thither like wandering gleams of sunshine on these busy days of farewell. Her great blue eyes had a pretty, mournful look, in charming unison with the soft pressure of her little hand, and that friendly, though perhaps rather stereotyped speech, in which she told her visitors how she was so sorry to lose them, and how she didn't know what she should do till they came once more to enliven the court by their charming society. But however sorry my lady might be to lose her visitors, there was at least one guest whose society she was not deprived of. Robert Audley showed no intention of leaving his uncle's house. He had no professional duties, he said. Figtree Court was delightfully shady in hot weather, but there was a sharp corner round which the wind came in the winter months, armed with avenging rheumatisms and influenzas. Everybody was so good to him at the court, that really he had no inclination to hurry away. Sir Michael had but one answer to this. "Stay, my dear boy, stay, my dear Bob, as long as ever you like. I have no son, and you stand to me in the place of one. Make yourself agreeable to Lucy, and make the court your home as long as you live." To which Robert would merely reply by grasping his uncle's hand vehemently, and muttering something about a jolly old prince. It was to be observed that there was sometimes a certain vague sadness in the young man's tone when he called Sir Michael a jolly old prince, some shadow of affectionate regret that brought a mist into Robert's eyes as he sat in a corner of the room looking thoughtfully at the white-bearded baronet. Before the last of the young sportsmen departed, Sir Harry Towers demanded and obtained an interview with Miss Alicia Audley in the oak library, an interview in which considerable emotion was displayed by the stalwart young fox-hunter, so much emotion, indeed, and of such a genuine and honest character, that Alicia fairly broke down as she told him she should forever esteem and respect him for his true and noble heart, but that he must never, never, unless he wished to cause her the most cruel distress, ask more from her than this esteem and respect. Sir Harry left the library by the French window opening into the pond garden. He strolled into that very lime walk which George Talboys had compared to an avenue in a churchyard, and under the leafless trees fought the battle of his brave young heart. "What a fool I am to feel it like this," he cried, stamping his foot upon the frosty ground. "I always knew it would be so. I always knew that she was 100 times too good for me. God bless her. How nobly and tenderly she spoke. How beautiful she looked with the crimson blushes under her brown skin, and the tears in her big gray eyes. Almost as handsome as the day she took the sunk fence, and let me put the brush in her hat as we rode home. God bless her. I can get over anything as long as she doesn't care for that sneaking lawyer, but I couldn't stand that." That sneaking lawyer, by which appellation Sir Harry alluded to Mr. Robert Audley, was standing in the hall, looking at a map of the Midland counties, when Alicia came out of the library with red eyes, after her interview with the fox-hunting baronet. Robert, who was short-sighted, had his eyes within half an inch of the surface of the map as the young lady approached him. "Yes," he said, "Norwich is in Norfolk, and that fool young Vincent said it was in Herefordshire. Ha, Alicia, is that you?" He turned round so as to intercept Miss Audley on her way to the staircase. "Yes," replied his cousin curtly, trying to pass him. "Alicia, you have been crying." The young lady did not condescend to reply. "You have been crying, Alicia. Sir Harry Towers, of Towers Park, in the county of Hertfordshire, has been making you an offer of his hand, eh?" "Have you been listening at the door, Mr. Audley?" "I have not, Miss Audley. On principle I object to listen, and in practice I believe it to be a very troublesome proceeding, but I am a barrister, Miss Alicia, and able to draw a conclusion by induction. Do you know what inductive evidence is, Miss Audley?" "No," replied Alicia, looking at her cousin as a handsome young panther might look at its daring tormentor. "I thought not. I dare say Sir Harry would ask if it was a kind of new horse-ball. I knew by induction that the baronet was going to make you an offer. First, because he came downstairs with his hair parted on the wrong side, and his face as pale as a tablecloth. Secondly, because he couldn't eat any breakfast, and let his coffee go the wrong way. And thirdly, because he asked for an interview with you before he left the court. Well, how's it to be, Alicia? Do we marry the baronet, and is poor cousin Bob to be the best man at the wedding?" "Sir Harry Towers is a noble-hearted young man," said Alicia, still trying to pass her cousin. "But do we accept him? Yes or no?
Are we to be Lady Towers, with a superb estate in Hertfordshire, summer quarters for our hunters, and a drag with outriders to drive us across to Papa's place in Essex? Is it to be so, Alicia, or not?"
"What is that to you, Mr. Robert Audley?" cried Alicia passionately. "What do you care what becomes of me, or whom I marry? If I married a chimney sweep, you'd only lift up your eyebrows and say, 'Bless my soul, she always was eccentric.' I have refused Sir Harry Towers, but when I think of his generous and unselfish affection, and compare it with the heartless, lazy, selfish, supercilious indifference of other men, I've a good mind to run after him and tell him—"
"That you'll retract, and be my Lady Towers?"
"Yes."
"Then don't, Alicia, don't,"
said Robert Audley, grasping his cousin's slender wrist, and leading her upstairs.
"Come into the drawing-room with me, Alicia, my poor little cousin. My charming, impetuous, alarming little cousin. Sit down here in this mullioned window, and let us talk seriously, and leave off quarreling if we can."
The cousins had the drawing-room all to themselves. Sir Michael was out, my lady in her own apartments, and poor Sir Harry Towers walking up and down upon the gravel walk, darkened with the flickering shadows of the leafless branches in the cold winter sunshine.
"My poor little Alicia," said Robert, as tenderly as if he had been addressing some spoiled child. "Do you suppose that because people don't wear vinegar tops, or part their hair on the wrong side, or conduct themselves altogether after the manner of well-meaning maniacs, by way of proving the vehemence of their passion—do you suppose because of this, Alicia Audley, that they may not be just as sensible of the merits of a dear little warm-hearted and affectionate girl as ever their neighbors can be? Life is such a very troublesome matter, when all is said and done, that it's as well even to take its blessings quietly. I don't make a great howling because I can get good cigars one door from the corner of Chancery Lane, and have a dear good girl for my cousin, but I am not the less grateful to Providence that it is so."
Alicia opened her gray eyes to their widest extent, looking her cousin full in the face with a bewildered stare. Robert had picked up the ugliest and leanest of his attendant curs, and was placidly stroking the animal's ears. "Is this all you have to say to me, Robert?" said Miss Audley, meekly.
"Well, yes, I think so," replied her cousin, after considerable deliberation. "I fancy that what I wanted to say was this: don't marry the fox-hunting baronet if you like anybody else better, for if you'll only be patient and take life easily, and try and reform yourself of banging doors, bouncing in and out rooms, talking of the stables, and riding across country, I've no doubt the person you prefer will make you a very excellent husband."
"Thank you, cousin," said Miss Audley, crimsoning with bright, indignant blushes up to the roots of her waving brown hair. "But as you may not know the person I prefer, I think you had better not take upon yourself to answer for him." Robert pulled the dog's ears thoughtfully for some moments.
"No, to be sure," he said after a pause. "Of course, if I don't know him. I thought I did."
"Did you?" exclaimed Alicia, and opening the door with a violence that made her cousin shiver, she bounced out of the drawing-room.
"I only said I thought I knew him,"
Robert called after her, and then, as he sunk into an easy-chair, he murmured thoughtfully,
"Such a nice girl, too, if she didn't bounce."
So poor Sir Harry Towers rode away from Audley Court, looking very crestfallen and dismal. He had very little pleasure in returning to the stately mansion, hidden among sheltering oaks and venerable beeches. The square red-brick house, gleaming at the end of a long arcade of leafless trees, was to be forever desolate, he thought, since Alicia would not come to be its mistress. 100 improvements planned and thought of were dismissed from his mind as useless now. The hunter that Jim the trainer was breaking in for a lady, the 2 pointer pups that were being reared for the next shooting season, the big black retriever that would have carried Alicia's parasol, the pavilion in the garden, disused since his mother's death, but which she had meant to have restored for Miss Audley. All these things were now so much vanity and vexation of spirit.
"What's the good of being rich if one has no one to help spend one's money?" said the young baronet. "One only grows a selfish beggar, and takes to drinking too much port. It's a hard thing that a girl can refuse a true heart, and such stables as we've got at the park. It unsettles a man somehow."
Indeed, this unlooked-for rejection had very much unsettled the few ideas which made up the small sum of the baronet's mind. He had been desperately in love with Alicia ever since the last hunting season, when he had met her at the county ball. His passion, cherished through the slow monotony of a summer, had broken out afresh in the merry winter months, and the young man's mauvaise honte alone had delayed the offer of his hand. But he had never for a moment supposed that he would be refused. He was so used to the adulation of mothers who had daughters to marry, and of even the daughters themselves. He had been so accustomed to feel himself the leading personage in an assembly, although half the wits of the age had been there, and he could only say, "Ha, to be sure," and "By Jove, He had been so spoiled by the flatteries of bright eyes that looked, or seemed to look, the brighter when he drew near, that without being possessed of one shadow of personal vanity, he had yet come to think that he had only to make an offer to the prettiest girl in Essex to behold himself immediately accepted. "Yes," he would say complacently to some admiring satellite, "I know I'm a good match, and I know what makes the gals so civil. They're very pretty, and they're very friendly to a fellow, but I don't care about 'em. They're all alike. They can only drop their eyes and say, 'Lor, Sir Harry, why do you call that curly black dog a retriever?' Or, 'Oh, Sir Harry, and did the poor mare really sprain her pastern shoulder blade?' I haven't got much brains myself, I know," the baronet would add deprecatingly, "and I don't want a strong-minded woman who writes books and wears green spectacles, but hang it, I like a gal who knows what she's talking about." So when Alicia said "no," or rather made that pretty speech about esteem and respect, which well-bred young ladies substitute for the obnoxious monosyllable, Sir Harry Towers felt that the whole fabric of the future he had built so complacently was shivered into a heap of dingy ruins. Sir Michael grasped him warmly by the hand just before the young man mounted his horse in the courtyard. "I'm very sorry, Towers," he said. "You're as good a fellow as ever breathed, and would have made my girl an excellent husband. But you know there's a cousin, and I think that—" "Don't say that, Sir Michael," interrupted the fox hunter energetically. "I can get over anything but that. A fellow whose hand upon the curb weighs half a ton. Why, he pulled the cavalier's mouth to pieces, sir, the day you let him ride the horse. A fellow who turns his collars down and eats bread and marmalade. No, no, Sir Michael. It's a queer world, but I can't think that of Miss Audley. There must be someone in the background, sir. It can't be the cousin." Sir Michael shook his head as the rejected suitor rode away. "I don't know about that," he muttered. "Bob's a good lad, and the girl might do worse, but he hangs back as if he didn't care for her. There's some mystery. The old baronet said this in that semi-thoughtful tone with which we speak of other people's affairs. The shadows of the early winter twilight, gathering thickest under the low oak ceiling of the hall and the quaint curve of the arched doorway, fell darkly around his handsome head, but the light of his declining life, his beautiful and beloved young wife, was near him, and he could see no shadows when she was by. She came skipping through the hall to meet him, and shaking her golden ringlets, buried her bright head on her husband's breast. "So the last of our visitors is gone, dear, and we're all alone," she said. "Isn't that nice?" "Yes, darling," he answered fondly, stroking her bright hair. "Except Mr. Robert Audley. How long is that nephew of yours going to stay here?" "As long as he likes, my pet. He's always welcome," said the baronet, and then, as if remembering himself, he added tenderly, "But not unless his visit is agreeable to you, darling. Not if his lazy habits, or his smoking, or his dogs, or anything about him is displeasing to you." Lady Audley pursed up her rosy lips and looked thoughtfully at the ground. "It isn't that," she said hesitatingly. "Mr. Audley is a very agreeable young man, and a very honorable young man. But you know, Sir Michael, I'm rather a young aunt for such a nephew, and—" "And what, Lucy?" asked the baronet fiercely. "Poor Alicia is rather jealous of any attention Mr. Audley pays me, and I think it would be better for her happiness if your nephew were to bring his visit to a close." "He shall go tonight, Lucy," exclaimed Sir Michael. "I am a blind, neglectful fool not to have thought of this before. My lovely little darling. It was scarcely just to Bob to expose the poor lad to your fascinations. I know him to be as good and true-hearted a fellow as ever breathed, but he shall go tonight." "But you won't be too abrupt, dear. You won't be rude." "Rude? No, Lucy. I left him smoking in the lime walk.
I'll go and tell him that he must get out of the house in an hour."
So in that leafless avenue, under whose gloomy shade George Talboys had stood on that thunderous evening before the day of his disappearance, Sir Michael Audley told his nephew that the Court was no home for him, and that my lady was too young and pretty to accept the attentions of a handsome nephew of 28. Robert only shrugged his shoulders and elevated his thick black eyebrows as Sir Michael delicately hinted all this.
"I have been attentive to my lady," he said. "She interests me."
And then, with a change in his voice, and an emotion not common to him, he turned to the baronet, and grasping his hand, exclaimed,
"God forbid, my dear uncle, that I should ever bring trouble upon such a noble heart as yours. God forbid that the slightest shadow of dishonor should ever fall upon your honored head, least of all through agency of mine."
The young man uttered these few words in a broken and disjointed fashion, in which Sir Michael had never heard him speak before, and then turning away his head, fairly broke down. He left the Court that night, but he did not go far. Instead of taking the evening train for London, he went straight up to the little village of Mount Stanning, and walking into the neatly kept inn, asked Phoebe Marks if he could be accommodated with apartments. Chapter 17. At the Castle Inn. The little sitting-room into which Phoebe Marks ushered the baronet's nephew was situated on the ground floor, and only separated by a lath and plaster partition from the little bar parlor occupied by the innkeeper and his wife. It seemed as though the wise architect who had superintended the building of the Castle Inn had taken especial care that nothing but the frailest and most flimsy materials should be used, and that the wind, having a special fancy for this unprotected spot, should have full play for the indulgence of its caprices. To this end pitiful woodwork had been used instead of solid masonry, rickety ceilings had been propped up by fragile rafters, and beams that threatened on every stormy night to fall upon the heads of those beneath them, doors whose specialty was never to be shut, yet always to be banging, windows constructed with a peculiar view to letting in the draught when they were shut, and keeping out the air when they were open. The hand of genius had devised this lonely country inn, and there was not an inch of woodwork or a trowelful of plaster employed in all the rickety construction that did not offer its own peculiar weak point to every assault of its indefatigable foe. Robert looked around him with a feeble smile of resignation. It was a change, decidedly, from the luxurious comforts of Audley Court, and it was rather a strange fancy of the young barrister to prefer loitering at this dreary village hostelry to returning to his snug chambers in Fig-tree Court. But he had brought his lares and penates with him, in the shape of his German pipe, his tobacco canister, half a dozen French novels, and his 2 ill-conditioned canine favorites, which sat shivering before the smoky little fire, barking shortly and sharply now and then, by way of hinting for some slight refreshment. While Mr. Robert Audley contemplated his new quarters, Phoebe Marks summoned a little village lad who was in the habit of running errands for her, and taking him into the kitchen, gave him a tiny note, carefully folded and sealed. "You know Audley Court?" "Yes, mum." "If you'll run there with this letter tonight, and see that it's put safely in Lady Audley's hands, I'll give you a shilling." "Yes, mum." "You understand? Ask to see my lady. You can say you have a message, not a note, mind, but a message from Phoebe Marks, and when you see her, give this into her own hand." "Yes, mum." "You won't forget?" "No, mum." "Then be off with you." The boy waited for no second bidding, but in another moment was scuttling along the lonely high road, down the sharp descent that led to Audley. Phoebe Marks went to the window, and looked out at the black figure of the lad hurrying through the dusky winter evening. "If there's any bad meaning in his coming here," she thought, "my lady will know of it in time, at any rate." Phoebe herself brought the neatly arranged tea-tray and the little covered dish of ham and eggs which had been prepared for this unlooked-for visitor. Her pale hair was as smoothly braided, and her light gray dress fitted as precisely as of old. The same neutral tints pervaded her person and her dress. No showy rose-colored ribbons or rustling silk gown proclaimed the well-to-do innkeeper's wife. Phoebe Marks was a person who never lost her individuality. Silent and self-constrained, she seemed to hold herself within herself, and take no color from the outer world. Robert looked at her thoughtfully as she spread the cloth, and drew the table nearer to the fireplace. "That," he thought, "is a woman who could keep a secret." The dogs looked rather suspiciously at the quiet figure of Mrs. Marks gliding softly about the room, from the teapot to the caddy, and from the caddy to the kettle singing on the hob. "Will you pour out my tea for me, Mrs. Marks?" said Robert, seating himself on a horsehair-covered armchair, which fitted him as tightly in every direction as if he had been measured for it. "You have come from the court, sir?" said Phoebe, as she handed Robert the sugar basin. "Yes, I only left my uncle's an hour ago." "And my lady, sir, was she quite well?" "Yes, quite well." "As gay and light-hearted as ever, sir?" "As gay and light-hearted as ever." Phoebe retired respectfully after having given Mr. Audley his tea, but as she stood with her hand upon the lock of the door, he spoke again. "You knew Lady Audley when she was Miss Lucy Graham, did you not?" he asked. "Yes, sir. I lived at Mrs. Dawson's when my lady was governess there." "Indeed. Was she long in the surgeon's family?" "A year and a half, sir." "And she came from London?" "Yes, sir." "And she was an orphan, I believe?" "Yes, sir." "Always as cheerful as she is now?" "Always, sir." Robert emptied his teacup and handed it to Mrs. Marks. Their eyes met, a lazy look in his, and an active, searching glance in hers. This woman would be good in a witness box, he thought. It would take a clever lawyer to bother her in a cross-examination. He finished his second cup of tea, pushed away his plate, fed his dogs, and lighted his pipe, while Phoebe carried off the tea-tray. The wind came whistling up across the frosty, open country, and through the leafless woods, and rattled fiercely at the window frames. "There's a triangular draught from those two windows in the door that scarcely adds to the comfort of this apartment," murmured Robert. "And there certainly are pleasanter sensations than that of standing up to one's knees in cold water." He poked the fire, patted his dogs, put on his greatcoat, rolled a rickety old sofa close to the hearth, wrapped his legs in his railway rug, and stretching himself at full length upon the narrow horsehair cushion, smoked his pipe, and watched the bluish-gray wreaths curling upward to the dingy ceiling. "No," he murmured again, "that is a woman who can keep a secret. A counsel for the prosecution could get very little out of her." I have said that the bar-parlor was only separated from the sitting-room occupied by Robert by a lath and plaster partition. The young barrister could hear the 2 or 3 village tradesmen and a couple of farmers laughing and talking round the bar, while Luke Marks served them from his stock of liquors. Very often he could even hear their words, especially the landlord's, for he spoke in a coarse, loud voice, and had a more boastful manner than any of his customers. "The man is a fool," said Robert, as he laid down his pipe. "I'll go and talk to him by and by." He waited till the few visitors to the castle had dropped away one by one, and when Luke Marks had bolted the door upon the last of his customers, he strolled quietly into the bar-parlor, where the landlord was seated with his wife. Phoebe was busy at a little table, upon which stood a prim work-box, with every reel of cotton and glistening steel bodkin in its appointed place. She was darning the coarse gray stockings that adorned her husband's awkward feet, but she did her work as daintily as if they had been my lady's delicate silken hose. I say that she took no color from external things, and that the vague air of refinement that pervaded her nature clung to her as closely in the society of her boorish husband at the Castle Inn as in Lady Audley's boudoir at the court. She looked up suddenly as Robert entered the bar-parlor. There was some shade of vexation in her pale gray eyes, which changed to an expression of anxiety, nay, rather of almost terror, as she glanced from Mr. Audley to Luke Marks. "I've come in for a few minutes' chat before I go to bed," said Robert, settling himself very comfortably before the cheerful fire. "Would you object to a cigar, Mrs. Marks? I mean, of course, to my smoking one," he added explanatorily. "Not at all, sir." "It would be a good un her objecting to a bit of bacca," growled Mr. Marks, "when me and the customers smokes all day." Robert lighted his cigar with a gilt paper match of Phoebe's making that adorned the chimney-piece, and took half a dozen reflective puffs before he spoke. "I want you to tell me all about Mount Stanning, Mr. Marks," he said presently. "Then that's pretty soon told," replied Luke, with a harsh, grating laugh. "Of all the dull holes as ever a man set foot in, this is about the dullest. Not that the business don't pay pretty tidy, I don't complain of that, but I should 'a' liked a public at Chelmsford, or Brentwood, or Romford, or some place where there's a bit of life in the streets.
And I might have had it," he added, discontentedly, "if folks hadn't been so precious stingy."
As her husband muttered this complaint in a grumbling undertone, Phoebe looked up from her work and spoke to him. "We forgot the brewhouse door, Luke," she said. "Will you come with me and help me put up the bar?"
"The brewhouse door can bide for tonight," said Mr. Marks. "I ain't a-going to move now. I've seated myself for a comfortable smoke."
He took a long clay pipe from a corner of the fender as he spoke, and began to fill it deliberately. "I don't feel easy about that brewhouse door, Luke," remonstrated his wife. "There are always tramps about, and they can get in easily when the bar isn't up."
"Go and put the bar up yourself, then, can't you?" asked Mr. Marks.
"It's too heavy for me to lift."
"Then let it bide, if you're too fine a lady to see to it yourself. You're very anxious all of a sudden about this here brewhouse door. I suppose you don't want me to open my mouth to this here gent, that's about it. Oh, you needn't frown at me to stop my speaking. You're always putting in your tongue and clipping off my words before I'd half said 'em, but I won't stand it. Do you hear? I won't stand it."
Phoebe Marks shrugged her shoulders, folded her work, and shut her work-box, and crossing her hands in her lap, sat with her gray eyes fixed upon her husband's bull-like face.
"Then you don't particularly care to live at Mount Stanning?" said Robert, politely, as if anxious to change the conversation. "No, I don't," answered Luke, "and I don't care who knows it. And as I said before, if folks hadn't been so precious stingy, I might have had a public and a thriving market town instead of this tumble-down old place, where a man has his hair blowed off his head on a windy day. What's £50, or what's £100?
Luke!
No, you're not going to stop my mouth with all your Lukes, answered Mr. Marks to his wife's remonstrance. "I say again, what's £100?"
"No," answered Robert Audley, with a wonderful distinctness, and addressing his words to Luke Marks, but fixing his eyes upon Phoebe's anxious face.
"What indeed is £100 to a man possessed of the power which you hold, or rather which your wife holds, over the person in question?"
Phoebe's face, at all times almost colorless, seemed scarcely capable of growing paler, but as her eyelids drooped under Robert Audley's searching glance, a visible change came over the pallid hues of her complexion.
"12:15, said Robert, looking at his watch. "Late hours for such a quiet village as Mount Stanning. Good night, my worthy host. Good night, Mrs. Marks. You needn't send me my shaving water till 9 o'clock tomorrow morning."
Chapter 18. Robert receives a visitor whom he had scarcely expected. 11 o'clock struck the next morning, and found Mr. Robert Audley still lounging over the well-ordered little breakfast-table, with one of his dogs at each side of his armchair, regarding him with watchful eyes and open mouths, awaiting the expected morsel of ham or toast. Robert had a county paper on his knees, and made a feeble effort now and then to read the first page, which was filled with advertisements of farming stock, quack medicines, and other interesting matter. The weather had changed, and the snow, which had for the last few days been looming blackly in the frosty sky, fell in great feathery flakes against the windows, and lay piled in the little bit of garden ground without. The long, lonely road leading toward Audley seemed untrodden by a footstep, as Robert Audley looked out at the wintry landscape.
"Lively," he said, "for a man used to the fascinations of Temple Bar."
As he watched the snowflakes falling every moment thicker and faster upon the lonely road, he was surprised by seeing a brougham driving slowly up the hill.
"I wonder what unhappy wretch has too restless a spirit to stop at home on such a morning as this," he muttered, as he returned to the armchair by the fire.
He had only reseated himself a few moments when Phoebe Marks entered the room to announce Lady Audley.
"Lady Audley? Pray beg her to come in," said Robert.
And then, as Phoebe left the room to usher in this unexpected visitor, he muttered between his teeth,
"A false move, my lady, and one I never looked for from you."
Lucy Audley was radiant on this cold and snowy January morning. Other people's noses are rudely assailed by the sharp fingers of the grim ice-king, but not my lady's. Other people's lips turn pale and blue with the chilling influence of the bitter weather, but my lady's pretty little rosebud of a mouth retained its brightest coloring and cheeriest freshness. She was wrapped in the very sables which Robert Audley had brought from Russia, and carried a muff that the young man thought seemed almost as big as herself. She looked a childish, helpless, babified little creature, and Robert looked down upon her with some touch of pity in his eyes, as she came up to the hearth by which he was standing, and warmed her tiny gloved hands at the blaze. "What a morning, Mr. Audley," she said. "What a morning."
"Yes, indeed. Why did you come out in such weather?"
"Because I wished to see you, particularly."
"Indeed?"
"Yes," said my lady, with an air of considerable embarrassment, playing with the button of her glove, and almost wrenching it off in her restlessness. "Yes, Mr. Audley, I felt that you had not been well treated, that you had, in short, reason to complain, and that an apology was due to you."
"I do not wish for any apology, Lady Audley."
"But you are entitled to one," answered my lady quietly. "Why, my dear Robert, should we be so ceremonious toward each other? You were very comfortable at Audley. We were very glad to have you there. But my dear, silly husband must needs take it into his foolish head that it is dangerous for his poor little wife's peace of mind to have a nephew of 8 or 9 and 20 smoking his cigars in her boudoir, and behold, our pleasant little family circle is broken up." Lucy Audley spoke with that peculiar childish vivacity which seemed so natural to her, Robert looking down almost sadly at her bright, animated face.
"Lady Audley," he said, "Heaven forbid that either you or I should ever bring grief or dishonor upon my uncle's generous heart. Better perhaps that I should be out of the house. Better perhaps that I had never entered it."
My lady had been looking at the fire while her nephew spoke, but at his last words she lifted her head suddenly, and looked him full in the face with a wondering expression, an earnest, questioning gaze, whose full meaning the young barrister understood.
"Oh, pray do not be alarmed, Lady Audley," he said gravely. "You have no sentimental nonsense, no silly infatuation borrowed from Balzac or Dumas fils to fear from me. The benchers of the Inner Temple will tell you that Robert Audley is troubled with none of the epidemics whose outward signs are turn-down collars and Byronic neckties. I say that I wish I had never entered my uncle's house during the last year, but I say it with a far more solemn meaning than any sentimental one."
My lady shrugged her shoulders. "If you insist on talking in enigmas, Mr. Audley," she said, "you must forgive a poor little woman if she declines to answer them." Robert made no reply to this speech. "But tell me," said my lady, with an entire change of tone, "what could have induced you to come up to this dismal place?"
"Curiosity."
"Curiosity?"
"Yes, I felt an interest in that bull-necked man with the dark red hair and wicked gray eyes. A dangerous man, my lady, a man in whose power I should not like to be."
A sudden change came over Lady Audley's face. The pretty roseate flush faded out from her cheeks, and left them waxen white, and angry flashes lightened in her blue eyes. "What have I done to you, Robert Audley?" she cried passionately. "What have I done to you that you should hate me so?" He answered her very gravely.
"I had a friend, Lady Audley, whom I loved very dearly, and since I have lost him I fear that my feelings toward other people are strangely embittered."
"You mean the Mr. Talboys who went to Australia?"
"Yes, I mean the Mr. Talboys who I was told set out for Liverpool with the idea of going to Australia."
"And you do not believe in his having sailed for Australia?"
"I do not."
"But why not?"
"Forgive me, Lady Audley, if I decline to answer that question."
"As you please," she said carelessly.
"A week after my friend disappeared," continued Robert, "I posted an advertisement to the Sydney and Melbourne papers, calling upon him, if he was in either city when the advertisement appeared, to write and tell me of his whereabouts, and also calling on anyone who had met him, either in the colonies or on the voyage out, to give me any information respecting him. George Talboys left Essex, or disappeared from Essex, on the 6th of September last. I ought to receive some answer to this advertisement by the end of this month. Today is the 27th. The time draws very near."
"And if you receive no answer?" asked Lady Audley.
"If I receive no answer, I shall think that my fears have been not unfounded, and I shall do my best to act."
"What do you mean by that?"
"Ah, Lady Audley, you remind me how very powerless I am in this matter. My friend might have been made away with in this very inn, and I might stay here for a 12-month, and go away at the last as ignorant of his fate as if I had never crossed the threshold. What do we know of the mysteries that may hang about the houses we enter? If I were to go tomorrow into that commonplace, plebeian, 8-roomed house in which Maria Manning and her husband murdered their guest, I should have no awful prescience of that bygone horror. Foul deeds have been done under the most hospitable roofs. Terrible crimes have been committed amidst the fairest scenes, and have left no trace upon the spot where they were done. I do not believe in mandrake, or in blood-stains that no time can efface. I believe rather that we may walk unconsciously in an atmosphere of crime, and breathe none the less freely. I believe that we may look into the smiling face of a murderer, and admire its tranquil beauty."
My lady laughed at Robert's earnestness. "You seem to have quite a taste for discussing these horrible subjects," she said, rather scornfully. "You ought to have been a detective police officer."
"I sometimes think I should have been a good one."
"Why?"
"Because I am patient."
But to return to Mr. George Talboys, whom we lost sight of in your eloquent discussion. What if you receive no answer to your advertisements?"
"I shall then consider myself justified in concluding my friend is dead."
"Yes, and then?"
"I shall examine the effects he left at my chambers."
"Indeed, and what are they?
Coats, waistcoats, varnished boots, and meerschaum pipes, I suppose," said Lady Audley, laughing. "No, letters from his friends, his old schoolfellows, his father, his brother officers."
"Yes."
"Letters, too, from his wife."
My lady was silent for some moments, looking thoughtfully at the fire. "Have you ever seen any of the letters written by the late Mrs. Talboys?" she asked presently.
"Never. Poor soul, her letters are not likely to throw much light upon my friend's fate. I dare say she wrote the usual womanly scrawl. There are very few who write so charming and uncommon a hand as yours, Lady Audley."
"Ah, you know my hand, of course."
"Yes, I know it very well indeed."
My lady warmed her hands once more, and then taking up the big muff which she had laid aside upon a chair, prepared to take her departure. "You have refused to accept my apology, Mr. Audley," she said, "but I trust you are not the less assured of my feelings toward you."
"Perfectly assured, Lady Audley."
"Then good-bye, and let me recommend you not to stay long in this miserable draughty place, if you do not wish to take rheumatism back to Fig-tree Court."
"I shall return to town tomorrow morning to see after my letters."
"Then once more, good-bye." She held out her hand. He took it loosely in his own. It seemed such a feeble little hand that he might have crushed it in his strong grasp, had he chosen to be so pitiless. He attended her to her carriage, and watched it as it drove off, not toward Audley, but in the direction of Brentwood, which was about 6 miles from Mount Stanning. About an hour and a half after this, as Robert stood at the door of the inn, smoking a cigar and watching the snow falling in the whitened fields opposite, he saw the brougham drive back, empty this time, to the door of the inn.
"Have you taken Lady Audley back to the Court?"
he said to the coachman, who had stopped to call for a mug of hot spiced ale.
"No, sir. I've just come from the Brentwood station. My lady started for London by the 12:40 train." "For town?"
"Yes, sir."
"My lady gone to London," said Robert, as he returned to the little sitting-room. "Then I'll follow her by the next train, and if I'm not very much mistaken, I know where to find her."
He packed his portmanteau, paid his bill, fastened his dogs together with a couple of leathern collars and a chain, and stepped into the rumbling fly kept by the Castle Inn for the convenience of Mount Stanning. He caught an express that left Brentwood at 3 o'clock, and settled himself comfortably in a corner of an empty first-class carriage, coiled up in a couple of railway rugs, and smoking a cigar in mild defiance of the authorities.